The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Coet, Managing Director and co-founder of OnFrontiers. OnFrontiers is a peer-to-peer knowledge platform that helps organizations, large and small, explore new markets, make better decisions, and expand their impact. For most of the questions we face while pursuing opportunities in developing markets, someone has gone before us. OnFrontiers helps you quickly connect with the right professional who can share insights that save time and resources and give you an edge. If you'd like to learn more about us, please visit our website or email us at hello@onfrontiers.com. On behalf of our team, I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar series focused on research hacks that can give you an edge in developing market research. This first edition today focuses on interviewing experts, which is a core skill of many of our clients. This is an exciting topic and an interest to a wide range of consultants, investors, and business professionals trying to gather information from top professionals in the field. During the discussion, please type your questions into the area called questions so that presenters are able to respond to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you'll find this session useful for your work. Without further ado, I'll turn this over to seasoned management consultant James Hoffman.
Thanks, Brian. Can you hear me okay, for starters?
Absolutely.
Great. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to be moderating today's webinar, where we've got a great panel here of Petra and Alejandro, who will introduce themselves in a second. I'm here primarily because of my background in management consulting. 5 of those years were at McKinsey, where I led teams conducting a large number of expert interviews using expert networks like OnFrontiers, mostly in developed markets, but we had various fairly well-established best practices, some of which we'd like to share today. But I'm going to let Petra and Alejandro introduce themselves because they both bring unique perspective. Petra as a seasoned interviewer and Alejandro as a seasoned interviewee or expert. So Petra, maybe you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, this is Petra Cahill, and yeah, you can hear me okay, correct?
Yes.
Yes. So I have long-term experience working for NBC News, mostly in New York, but also in London. I've worked there for over 13 years, and the last 10 years as a digital editor for their website. I would edit original content and request and come up with story ideas and edit original content from all over the world, from Beijing to Islamabad to Havana. So I dealt with people in a wide range of circumstances, from being just in a place where it's hard to access the phone or being in a war zone and that kind of thing. So I have some experience with frontier markets and that to that degree.
Great. Alejandro?
Hi, my name is Alejandro Brenes. I'm the CEO of Enertiva. Enertiva is a renewable energy company with operations in 5 countries in Central America. I also worked in strategic consultant, so I know how the value in all of this, and I participated as an expert in for OnFrontiers.
Great. So let's dive in. Here is an idea of how we thought we would spend our time, but we'd love to run this as interactively as possible. We're going to go through the stages of typical research interviews first, and some of the best practices that we've come up with as a panel in advance of this webinar. We'll talk through those relatively briefly, and then we'll do a kind of panel interview where I'm going to ask Petra and Alejandro some questions before opening it up to Q&A. And like Brian said, you can submit your questions. We're going to take them in written form through the webinar, and then we'll field them on the audio here, but you should feel free to submit them at any point. You don't need to wait until we're in the Q&A session. We can see them and address them real time if they're relevant. Or if you have any questions on the exhibits as we go through, feel free to contribute the question. So I hope you're all looking at slide 4 now, where we've laid out, just to give us some structure as we talk through the typical stages that that clients of OnFrontiers and anyone using expert networks goes through when they're engaging an expert network, starting with the requesting part of the wheel, and then going the letter A, and then going through receiving some profiles, setting up the interviews, running the interview itself, and then what do you do after the interview? We've highlighted 2 of these stages in green, the requesting and the running the interview, because those are the ones where we're probably going to focus most of our time, because those are the areas where people typically have the least amount of intuitive experience when they're doing this for the first time or a couple of times. But I think it's worth running through some of the other areas that we're not going to spend a lot of time on too. This, by the way, could apply whether you're an individual person just self-structuring your research topic, or whether you're, in my experience, I've worked with teams as large as 10 people, where we've had to designate someone as the expert coordinator, as it were, to coordinate pooling all of the questions from that team of people, working on the profile sourcing, even the administrative side of scheduling the interviews and everything. But this really works just as well if you're only one person. The reason we're focusing on the first one, requesting, is because there's so much more than just putting out a sort of very, very thinly worded request for experts or a topic and country that you're interested in that can be done. And what a lot of people find the value of connecting with someone like OnFrontiers is in the questions that get posed back to them after they've made that first contact. And maybe they're looking at the telco sector in Angola, and immediately the representative from OnFrontiers will start asking them, well, what exactly is it you're interested in? What are your key questions? And you're already at that point into essentially the preparation for the interview. So that's why there's so much focus on this. It's more than just requesting telcos in Angola. It's really thinking through what are your research goals right from the get-go. I think B, while we're not going to talk about it a lot, is very important, because people potentially waste their time connecting with experts and talking to them, and can be disappointed during the interview because they didn't spend enough time going through their profile to realize that their expertise perhaps lay in a different area from what they're aiming to learn, or there's something else not appropriate for their goals. And the last one I'll touch on before we move on is D, that after the interview, it kind of goes without saying that there's a lot of value to be gained, not just from the obvious distilling your notes and the key takeaways from the interview, but also from giving feedback on the interview to your OnFrontiers coordinator, saying how the experience went, what was good and bad about the profile that they found for you. So let's keep moving, unless Petra or Alejandro, unless you think we're missing any key stages here, or you think the emphasis should be different.
No, I think you're right in the point. I think it's pretty clear the steps and the stages.
Okay, let's
absolutely. I would just to add, always good to prepare those questions that you have as much as you can in advance, so you have a good list of things to go through.
Well, on that note, this is, we've laid out here. We're looking at slide 5. We've laid out some of the I was going to say do's and don'ts, but these are really the best practices for when you're requesting your profile search from OnFrontiers. So it kind of goes beyond the first. The first topic is the clear topic description. Essentially, I think it's a case of the more information, the better. Because if you put yourself in the shoes of the team sourcing the profiles, really at the start they're completely blind, and it's really through this interaction with you that they get to know what you're looking for better. In my experience, this is vastly better done by phone, by talking through live with your OnFrontiers liaison, rather than just sending over an email request. Even the most structured email request can fall short of the information the team would find very helpful, and you can already start things interactive on the phone. The third bullet here, because I'm sure you're reading these for yourself, is very important, that you can and should feel free to challenge the OnFrontiers team to kind of do a lot of the work for you in thinking through your request by asking them, what else do you need to know? They are extremely experienced and skilled at sourcing the right profile for you, and they know what they need to know in some of these markets, perhaps as well as you do or better. So it's always good to ask them for advice. The second block bullets is important to me because we said more information the better, but then you run the risk of information overload for the team, and particularly if you're under time pressure. It's a common mistake when you have a very complex research effort that the team can be expending a lot of effort hunting down profiles for one of your, let's say, 5 sub-questions, when on that particular day you really only care about sub-question C, while they're very actively hunting on sub-question A. So that leads to the third last block of bullets on this page, which is it's an interactive process, and people's research goals change. It depends on the type of organization that you're working within. In my consulting experience, the research priorities changed on a couple of hourly basis almost. So in that context, a daily check-in with the profile sources was a requirement to make sure that everyone was still on the same, working on the same list of priorities at the right moment. So that's I think that covers a lot of the best practices of requesting profiles. Again, Petra or Alejandro, you have any other spin on these?
Yeah, I would just say that's a very good point about prioritizing, what it is that you're looking for, because obviously it's like a needle in a haystack. But if the OnFrontiers folks know what it is that you're looking for, that'll make it a lot easier. Because otherwise, it can, just in any interview situation, when you get too much information, it becomes a flood. And if it's more targeted, that's more useful.
Yeah, and following on that, it's really important to to have the main goal clear, and the set of questions, but the main goal is also how you distribute time so that the main goal is achieved, and also the main questions that the person want to answer. So it's like an answer first kind of thing. I recommend, in which the first couple of minutes is just what is the goal, and then together we can structure how we are going to use the time.
Mm-hmm. Alejandro, I think you're referring to once you find yourself on the phone with the expert, correct?
Yeah.
Right. Which is even important. The answer first thing is important to have in mind, even when you're requesting the profiles that you want. I don't think it says anywhere here, but the single greatest, most useful tool that I've found in my experience is liberally giving the profile searchers the names of specific companies or organizations that you're looking for, that for you represent the perfect profile that you're looking for. So it's totally fine to say, like, I want to talk to an ex-employee of Angola Telecom, or an ex-employee or current employee of any of these three companies, and give them the list of companies, because that level of specificity is extremely helpful in the search process. I'm going to keep us moving along. On page 6, we just laid out. It's a fairly intuitive fact that people sort of recognize that people have wildly different research needs, and one of the earliest bits of context that you can give the profile searchers and your expert once you get on the phone with them is a broad sense of what stage, what is the research effort that you're undertaking, and what stage are you at in that effort, and essentially how much do you know about what you're asking about already. This is very important context, whether it's for the searchers, profile searchers, or for the expert once you find you're on the phone, to kind of bridge the gap in, you can assume your expert has very deep and granular experience in the topic that you're discussing, but that's usually the case, I hope. But there's always some gap, knowledge gap or asymmetry between the expert and the person dialing in as the interviewer that needs to be bridged. And it's sometimes bewildering for the expert at the start to sort of understand what level of expertise or granularity to pitch what they're talking at to the interviewer. So this kind of context at my early, mid, or late stage is incredibly helpful. On page 7, we've laid out, this is a real-life example, or at least I thought it was a real-life example, of a request for a search in consumer electronics in Ghana and Nigeria. We wanted to put this on as a good example to be followed. It shows some of the attributes that we talked about. I'm at mid-stage in research. I'm looking, it doesn't specify the exact number of interviews we're looking for, but it specifies, if you look at the bottom line, Samsung, LG, Philips, GE employees, and then beyond just consumer electronics, some specific examples of components and equipment, and some specific topics, like they clearly want to get into cost drivers to build some kind of costing model and to be able to compare specific products, whether it's phones, computers, etc. So this, I think, is a very good example of a request. We're going to keep going to the second stage of interviewing that we wanted to focus on, which is once you find yourself in the interview itself. What we've got laid out on the left here is a kind of typical way that you might prepare for a 60-minute interview. You would sketch out, okay, this is how I'm going to spend my time, and essentially you're importantly doing 5 minutes of introductions, sharing your background, your research goals that we talked about, and some context for the call, and sharing right up front what are the key things that you're hoping to learn from this interview. And then really the rest of the first half of the call, in my experience, we would train teams to cover all of their, if you imagine 5 key questions at a high level, each one of which has 5 more sub-questions under it, we would guide people to cover all 5 of their key questions within the first 30 minutes of the interview, and then pause, take stock of how they're doing against those 5 questions, and reprioritize which of those they want to focus on and delve deeper on. Now, you might ask, how do I do that in the middle of a call, at the 30-minute mark? And this is a good example. It's totally fine to just say to the other person on the phone, excuse me, if you don't mind, I'm going to take a minute to reconsider my key questions and just decide how best to spend the remaining 25 minutes that we have together. So just give me a minute and go silent. That, while it sounds extremely strange, because it's an abnormal conversation process, I think most interviewees or experts would thank you for that level of thought, and thank you for the guidance and help in navigating the topics that are important to you. It's more important they feel valued, and you're getting value from their expertise than just having a good chat. So then the second half of the interview, you can probe deeper into the perhaps 2 or 3 of your 5 high-level questions that you think are most important to spend the time in granular detail on. The last 5 minutes also super important, because also in my experience, people can get extremely buried in the question list that they have prepared. The more so to the extent they've prepared that question list very carefully and thought through it, they can get so wound up in their own questions that they can completely miss the wood from the trees, and they can hang up the phone without either listening, without picking up on important cues from the expert, who may be sitting there thinking, well, why aren't you asking me about this? So the question we put here, was there anything else that you would have expected me to ask, is a vital and excellent question to get in that last 5 minutes or earlier. You could even do it at the halfway mark. I'm going to pause there. Petra or Alejandro, any thoughts on time management?
Yeah, this is Petra. I think the layout of this is really super helpful because you go over the main points that you need to take those couple of minutes at the beginning to really share backgrounds and to make the person feel comfortable, and that your understanding of where they come from, they understand where you're coming from, and that there's a sense of mutual respect between you and the interviewer and the expert, so that then you can go forward. And I think having that really probing or getting into your top questions, your top 5 questions in the first half an hour, and that pause is very effective to say, hold on, and let's all catch our breath and just give it a minute before moving forward. And then the key thing of always asking at the end, was there anything else I didn't ask or that I should have asked? Because that can trigger a whole bunch of other information, or just bring up other issues that you might not have thought of. That's why you're talking to the expert.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly, and in line with my previous intervention, I think this slide is, like a copy paste and have it like a best practice. So it's pretty clear and pretty useful, the information that you have in the slide.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that this is not this is not an ordinary conversation that you are having. It's your time. You've paid for it. The expert's being paid for it. You you should spend it however you would like to. Another interesting failing is sometimes interviewers, out of politeness, will let an expert rabbit on about some topic that is close to the expert's heart, which may not really be of great interest to the interviewer, just almost out of politeness or fear of interrupting them. If you want to be polite, the best way to address that is to say right up front at the start of the interview, don't be surprised if or don't be offended if I interrupt you from time to time and guide you to a different topic. I just want to make sure we're spending our time appropriately, or something like that. With that kind of introduction, that will make completely clear what's going on. But it's your time. Make sure you use it on the topics that are important to you. I'm going to keep us moving.
One other quick thing, just to say on that, James, on that panel, it said, get the experts to email you or to send you links to things. That's quite helpful, and depending on to send you, data, key figures, documents, etc., articles mentioned, or even simple things like if they mention the name of a town or a city or a plant or a company, and you don't know what the spelling is, to have them send you that via email, or if you're doing your interview via Skype, that they can Skype you as you're speaking. Things like that are quite helpful to make sure you're getting everything correctly.
Absolutely. We never touched on, I mean, here it says meet with your fellow interviewers before the call to make sure you're all on the same page. But we never even talked about the important topic of deciding who's going to be conducting the interview. Is it one person, or if you have a large team, sometimes there's a temptation to pull in 5 of your colleagues to kind of listen into this expert, to give them some flavor or feel or color. That's fine, as long as you're not all overriding each other with a sort of schizophrenic approach to questioning or an unplanned approach. It's usually best if one person is guiding the question asking. Even better if a second person can scribe. But for the most part, the more people conducting the interview or asking questions, the more disorganized it's going to be, and the less you're going to get out. I'm going to keep us going and move to the sort of panelist section, and I'm going to start off by asking you, Alejandro, and that's why I pulled up this slide. I wanted to ask both of you if you could tell us about an interview experience that you think illustrates some of the do's and don'ts or best practices that we've been talking about, so we can talk through a real example.
Well, sure. In this specific case, the client was in the later stage of the analysis, and I think when in a previous slide that you mentioned, it's proportionally valuable if you're in that part of the research. You can get more value of the interviewer, of the expert, if you're in that late stage. And basically, the client had specific questions. Probably, read your slide about how to structure the interview. Because we started with the most important goals, and it was around 5 different questions about the market and the regulation. And when that got answered, then we could focus in questions that started to pop up of these answers. So it was really valuable. It was straightforward. You know, time is money, and it's really valuable. So we were in line that we just have to focus in answering those questions and that goal, and it was, you know, it was achieved, and it was a good experience for both of us.
Did it feel at all artificial at the time that you were having the conversation, or no?
Well, no. You know, it's since, you know, I'm an expert in the subject, and you know, from the first minutes that we talked, I knew that they'd done the research that we needed to, you know, to immediately get in those questions. So, you know, it was a good preparation from the client, and we didn't waste time, you know, explaining like the basic stuff of the subject. So it was really good, and you know, full of value. It wasn't a small talk at all. It was like the main questions and answers, and it you know, in fact, you know, it was around an hour, and we covered all the subjects in 45 minutes, and even they run out of questions because the time was really good.
So that sounds like a very positive experience, and I understand it got very positive experience, very positive feedback. Let me ask you, Alejandro, if we stick with you, when you get on the phone for the first time with as an expert, and the interviewer comes on, what are some of the questions going through your mind, and what can the interviewer do to best address some of those questions? I think you mentioned in a prior conversation with me about, like, you weren't sure how much the interviewer knew about you, and you had a lot of questions in your mind. What were some of those thoughts or questions?
Sure, you know, it's also, you know, to start with the introduction of and a background of why, you know, they choose you, and why we're having that interview. And yeah, just to put you in the same page, I think it's really important. And you know, and I've been in the other side of the phone. We are also expanding to other countries, so, you know, it's just to put you in the place of the client and see how they could maximize their time, and you know, also to get the most value is to be like really clear and transparent, and you know, a quick introduction of, you know, what are they thinking, and what are the goals. And because, for example, it's really different if it's a company, or multilateral, or other type of organization. Also to understand the mindset that they have, and you know, the context of all the answers, and you know, to figure out quickly what are they looking for, what's behind those questions.
Do you think there's, I don't know, in this case with the interviewer, where the interviewer is based, but do you think there's anything different, or that people need to do differently about conducting interviews in emerging markets as opposed to developed markets?
Well, you know, it's pretty similar, but I think it's much more valuable in emerging markets for the clients, because, you know, in developed countries you have better media, better information. It's pretty common that what you read in the news or in different websites is not accurate for developing countries. So that's where OnFrontiers, it's really valuable. It's because, you know, and having also experience in strategic consulting and doing research for other markets, specifically in developing countries, you can't substitute like good interviews. It's like the number one source of real information. Specifically, if it involves regulation, if it involves government decisions, because normally what you get in the media or newspapers is just one version of that reality, and it's pretty tricky in developing countries what's behind the certain decisions, and what's behind all this analysis. So it's pretty similar regarding the interview, but I think it's much more valuable in developing countries.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask the same original question to you, Petra, but just before we dive in, let me remind people to field any questions that you want on the webinar, and we've already picked up one or two which we think we've covered, but feel free to field your questions if you have them as we go along. So Petra, maybe you could tell us about an experience of yours that you think talks to some of the principles we went through.
Yeah, I mean, it's different because I was doing more general interviews, but I think the premise of trying to to ask probing questions that you know what the answers are that you need, and if there's specific difficult questions and you need data or information to back up the answers to sort of press on. A different sort of context, but it reminded me of a situation in which I was interviewing an asylum seeker in the U.S. who was seeking asylum based on the idea that he had been tortured because of his political beliefs back in Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and West Africa. And it's a difficult situation because the person was basically going to be tried, and so they'd need evidence. But as an interview, I needed to speak with them about them being tortured, and talking to anybody about being tortured is obviously an uncomfortable and sort of difficult thing to ask, and to sort of, you got to push in and say, no, what happened? Could you explain what kind of torture? How did it happen? And then following up and saying, and do you have any evidence of this? Which, after somebody just told you some traumatic story, is kind of difficult because it makes it seem like you don't believe them if you're asking for data or evidence to prove their story. But one story in particular I remember where the person immediately shot back and said, yes, of course, my fiance is back in Cote d'Ivoire. She has all the medical records. She has all the records showing I was part of this political party and I was a leader in it, and why I had been targeted. And of course, I can give you that evidence and that documentation. And that's just an example of, that really worked. That's, as a journalist, that's exactly what I needed. I needed to get them to explain their situation, but then also to provide hard data and evidence. And so sometimes it can be awkward, but you got to just press on. And another part of that being that as Alejandro would probably speak to, that if somebody knows, if you've explained well what your questions are and what you're after at the outset of the interview, the person's agreed to be interviewed, and in this instance they've not only agreed, but they're being paid for their time. They're expecting difficult questions. They're going to anticipate having you ask them for hard data and information. So just go forward with that. Do as much as you can to get what you need.
Yeah, I think the journalist perspective is slightly different, because typically you're interviewing people who are not being paid for their time, and you have to get them to like you in order to share bits of information with you. And it's an interesting environment, which I think we can learn from in conducting expert interviews, to borrow some of the tradecraft, especially in the introduction section, to kind of establish some shared context with the interviewer. You don't have to make them love you, but you want them not to feel in minute 5 of the interview that they're just being ruthlessly and mechanically pumped for information, especially in some of these markets.
Exactly. As Alejandro said, I would imagine that if you're sitting here and you're the CEO of an organization in Costa Rica, you have a lot to bring to the table, and you want to know why they want to speak to you. And at the same time, if you're the expert, you want to know that the person who's calling to ask you questions has some respect for your background, has some respect for why your expertise, how you gain this expertise, your training, your education, and just having those couple of minutes of establishing a rapport at the beginning seems like that would go a long way to helping the expert feel at ease and confident that they're calling you because they respect your opinion, and they're calling you because they want to get your information. Because they hold you in some esteem, and that I think always helps. If you're asking somebody something and you're letting them know that you respect them and hold them in high regard, they're going to be more apt to help you out, even if they're getting paid for it, whatever. It's just that person-to-person thing, and since this is over the phone, there is a human interaction. It's not just email. So I think that's important.
I think you've had some experiences, Petra, also interviewing people from different language backgrounds, and you had some that initial 5 minutes as well for that. Is that right?
Yeah. I think that sometimes presuming that that perhaps the people who have hired OnFrontiers are calling from the U.S. or New York or wherever, and that they're calling an expert in another country who speaks English, but the accent of somebody in Pakistan versus China versus Cuba, their English is going to be a little different, and sometimes it's pretty rudimentary, but just that first couple of minutes of chit-chat and asking about their background, that can allow your ear as the interviewer to sort of adjust to however their manner of speaking is, and it just sort of gives you a second to sort of get a hold of what their accent is, so that obviously you want to be able to understand them as they speak, and also for them to get a handle on your manner of speaking as well.
Mm-hmm. Alejandro, I wanted to pick up on one of Petra's points and ask you. So, what is it that actually motivates you to be an expert, to help us get into your mind? Is it? I'm guessing it's not the money, but I don't know. Can you give us some insight into why it's important for you to be an expert and why you enjoy doing these calls, or why you do them?
Sure. Like I mentioned before, I have been in the other side of the phone, so I know how valuable this is, and it's just to share perspective and knowledge, and it's about opportunities and connections. So if you have the expertise, then it's good to share it. My main motivation is for helping others, and also share perspectives and knowledge, and expand the networks that you have.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Which I think reinforces what we've been saying. So I want to make sure this is really practically useful for the people dialed in as well. So part of being a journalist is also the tradecraft of physically interviewing people, Petra. My question for you is, how does one run an interactive interview where you're asking intelligent questions and being responsive to things that the expert is bringing up, while also taking good notes at the same time, so you can report back to your colleagues or write a final report or article? How do you multitask like that? Have you got any tips or tricks of the trade?
Sure. The one simple answer is always to try and record your conversation, which, obviously to tell the person that's on the other end of the phone, is it okay with you if I record this conversation for my note-taking? and just to make sure you've got that clear so everybody's okay with that. But that's quite helpful, because then while you're having your conversation, and particularly over the phone, when you aren't face-to-face, you do really need to be paying attention, but to be going through your questions and taking notes, and taking notes of things to follow up on, etc. And in some ways it's easier because your hands are free, because you're sitting at the phone. But basically, I take notes as I go, and since I'm recording, I'll pencil down the time when the person is saying something particularly relevant, particularly important that I want to get back to, and make sure I get. As a journalist, you need to, one of the reasons to record is to make sure you're getting a direct quote, a verbatim quote. And it's the same kind of thing where you just want to make sure you're getting the information totally clear. So, you just pencil down the time of when they said whatever X, Y, Z that was particularly relevant, so then you can go back later and listen to that call again and make sure you get that information clearly. But also just to be taking notes of what to ask next, or star or something that was like, oh, that's a good thing to follow up on. That's key as you're moving through things, because that goes to that point of probing further in the second half of the interview.
Mm-hmm. I would add a tip from my experience. Again, don't be afraid to ask the expert to just slow down, or repeat themselves.
Yes, yes.
And just, again, although it may at first seem awkward, once you've done it a couple of times, you'll probably get very good at it. There's no reason why they should be rattling on very fast, and you just lose a bunch of important insight because they were moving too fast. Again, it's your time to speed up or slow down as you like, and totally fine to get them to repeat something, clarify something, explain something, however basic it may be.
Absolutely, and that idea of also asking somebody to type, to send you, either if you're on Skype, to message you, or if you're, ask them to email you the name of the city, the name of that plant, the name of that organization that you're not quite getting the spelling of the city in China that you're unfamiliar with, to ask them to send it to you so that you have it correctly.
Mm-hmm. Got it. The only thing I would add, and Alejandro, chip in if you want, is we haven't talked about something I experienced a lot, which was not just the single interview, but you have a question list or battery of questions, and I might be conducting, well, to give you an idea, in the most intensive project that we did, we conducted 65 expert interviews on a similar question list, and there the key to asking the questions and recording was to have an extremely structured, basically buckets of questions in a literally Excel spreadsheet for capturing the response to each question from different types of experts. And having it structured so cleanly really helps a team or your colleagues understand you're developing, sort of keep up to speed on your developing understanding of each of your key topics. And you can tell, oh, this insight came from so-and-so, this insight came from so-and-so. If you're trying to put together research that feeds into some kind of integrated report or output, it's extremely helpful to spend the time structuring that question grid in advance. And it really makes your life tremendously easier, not just during the interview, but it makes the recording of the insights from the interview a 15 to 20-minute job to clean up your roughly typed notes, rather than a 2-hour job to retrieve your handwritten notes, listen to the recording again in places, and really it avoids you hang up the phone and then going, oh, now I've got to spend the time writing that up, which is everyone's kind of pain. So we only have one more question, which was what do people do if they have follow-up questions after the interview? And I think the OnFrontiers response to that is, my understanding is, you should feel free to contact the expert if it's a very short question that probably the rule of thumb is that would take them less than 10 minutes to respond to. So it's just something factual, or remind me what was the website that you referred to in that, or you said you had a report on this, could you send it to me? Typically, if it's going to run over 10 minutes, then the best way to recontact the expert is to go through your OnFrontiers liaison and recontact them that way. So there's no misunderstanding about how long it's going to take them, because if you estimate it's a 10-minute job, perhaps the expert thinks it might take them an hour. If you go through the OnFrontiers liaison, it will be very clear, and you'll probably get the best response to your question because it's running through the system, and the expert will treat it probably a little bit more seriously. But that shouldn't stop you reaching out and asking them, very factual little questions. We're at our time, so I'm going to thank Petra and Alejandro for a wonderful panel. Thank you for your insights, both from the perspective of a seasoned interviewer and a seasoned expert. For the participants, OnFrontiers is going to share around the content of this webinar, I believe both the slides and this is also a recorded podcast that people can access going forward. So you've been scribbling notes furiously, that will save you writing them up. You can always get this content from your OnFrontiers liaison. So thank you, Brian. Thank you to the OnFrontiers team, and thank you again, Petra and Alejandro.
Absolutely. Thanks.